I am humble as well and full of great expectation here in these conversations that have taken place, and I salute all that have presented before me, but also I thank the opportunity to be able to share from the perspective of spiritual leaders. First, let me thank the conveners of this wonderful conference, because it's not just merely a platform of discussing policy, and it's a meeting of destinies. And I believe, like all the speakers before have spoken, we are at such a strategic inflection point of history. Quite a lot is starting, and it is standing very fast. Thank you very much for considering that religious leaders have a part in the conversation of the forces of the future, specifically for Africa, but also for the world generally. I'm going to take us a little back very quickly to history, because many a time we tend to repeat the mistakes of our past, because many have not learned from our past. When we look at Africa, particularly in the story and narrative of colonialism, the diplomats who sat down to divide that dear nation or continent were helped by the missionaries who often first came to Europe and traveled inland. The maps, the linguistic studies, the reports provided by missions societies were the primary intelligence used by the colonial governments to draw their borders. And in a sense, the church provided the data for the division, even though they did not hold the pen. One Lord Salisbury, I think is a name, a previous British Prime Minister, famously said in 1890 in, I think, one of the writings called Scramble for Africa, that we've been engaged in drawing lines upon maps where no white man's feet have ever trod. We've been giving away mountains and rivers and lakes to each other, only hindered by the small impediment that we never knew exactly where the mountains and rivers and lakes were. That is how far the story of Africa goes. And in the words of a famous missionary explorer, David Livingstone, he popularized the idea that Africa could only be saved through three things. They were called the three C's: commerce, Christianity, and civilization. Why do I emphasize these things? Because we cannot ignore the part of religion in the building of a people. And in fact, it is said of the same Livingstone that in terms of changing the map of the world and the history of a continent, he was perhaps the most influential private individual of the century. So nothing in Africa right now happening has not had a connection with religion. I come from East Africa. Slave trade through the Arabs came with Islam. Right now, the world is grappling with the war that is happening between Iran and Israel, America, but many people do not see or cannot consider that this is more foundationally a religious thing. Yes, it has some political or major political connotations, but the foundation of life is spirituality. And here I imply that the dynamics that we use to record whatever plans we have for the change of Africa, the summits that we will have in the future, must be governed with some ideas about what the spiritual would imply about what we're planning to do. So I stand before you not merely as a voice from the pulpit, but as a witness to a divine shift in whatever is happening in the global history. This is a very special moment, because like many have said before, that for decades the global narrative surrounding Africa has been framed by the language of intervention. How can we help Africa? And although the question is even though the question is most often well-intentioned, Sometimes there are questions and fundamental flaws because it assumes that Africa is in a position of lack and that there is a monopoly of solutions on one side. And I believe this is what all the speakers today are trying to tackle, to find the balance where Africa as well can contribute to this conversation in a more balanced way. Let me submit to us firstly that sovereignty is not a political status merely. It's not a definition of borders. It's more than a flag or an anthem. True sovereignty begins by defining the soul of a people, the soul of a nation, the soul of a continent. And we cannot define the future of Africa without understanding the soul of Africa or the soul of a people. And there are two integral things that I must emphasize in the back end while we plan for that great continent. Number one, the principle of inherent value. Every faith and philosophical system represented in this room agrees on one fundamental truth, that human dignity is a non-negotiation. Many have carried the idea that they can help or try to build a people without considering how they will deal with the dignity of the people that they're trying to help, especially when the people that are being helped are looked at as deficits rather than assets. The second issue in defining the soul of Africa is Africa's harvests, what Africa has been endowed with. In essence, I'm sure everybody in this room knows that Africa is one of the richest continents. And I believe it calls for the law of reciprocity. The mind that because Africa has so much, it is expected that she should be paid of her wealth. I'll give us an example that is so glaring, and I believe many of you will connect with what I'm trying to communicate. For instance, for some of us who have done some research on coffee, I'm a stickler on that because I'm a coffee farmer myself, and Uganda is perhaps now the leading exporter of coffee from Africa. The global coffee market right now is between $490 to $510 billion. And yet all the coffee producing countries in the world only take 45 billion of that share. Let me say that again, that the global coffee market right now is between 490 million United States dollars to 510 billion dollars. And yet all the coffee producing countries receive only 45 billion of that. Africa, by total revenue, receives only 6.2 billion. Uganda, the biggest exporter of coffee in Africa, receives only 2.5 billion. And yet Germany has grown to the re-export value of $11.9 billion. Switzerland, $3.4 billion. Italy, the domestic value of coffee is $5.6 billion and an export value of $2.6 billion. I think there's a problem in that kind of equation. And if the question is helping Africa, how are we able to help grow the value of what she produces? Because until we can answer that kind of question, then even our definitions of trade will bear questions that the next generation will have to answer. The old paradigm was extractive, taking raw material and value out of us. The new paradigm must be generative. It must invest in building value with it. The third and last principle that must be considered in the building of the soul, or the definition or identity of the soul, is the internal canvas, conviction. It is the ability of a people to define their strategic trajectory from within and to be allowed to be who they really are. This is a wisdom that is deeper than political correctness, the agendas that are pushed by various individuals, intellectual correctness, etc., etc. Who is Africa? Who are we culturally? Who are we as a people? What do we think about life? Because we live in a time where it's as though a lot is being imposed on this dear continent. And if we don't budge to what is imposed, then we're to pay the price because we don't seem like we are aligned to the order. I'll give you examples of with Uganda, where we got to a point where we could not be given aid because we raised an opinion on how we deal with our own people touching sexuality. These issues must be answered at the core. I know there will be stamp and shake a few of us, but it's important that we emphasize these things. Now I want to finish very quickly, but there's a few things that I need to emphasize, especially in the investment of what has to be done for Africa from a spiritual perspective. We all agree that it has to engage the changing of the mindset. And there are three aspects that I believe I must emphasize on very quickly. What is the place of education? And we want to shift this conversation from simply information to transformation. Because we've spent decades educating the African child to fit into a global system designed in his absence. We focused on literacy, which is a good thing, but in part incomplete, because it invests in the ability to read the words of others at the expense of the ability to interpret their own potential. True education must be exhumation. It must dig out the gold buried within that man. To a point where one day when we're talking about African engineers, we're not just talking about people who understand engineering, but they are connected to their continent and they can build and curate ideas based on their continent and their education. I'll give you one simple example before I finish this point. When I was growing up in Uganda, up till now, recently we have emphasized this to a point where now our government has appreciated. When it came to history, we were only taught European history, only European history. So we were marked against how much of Europe we knew and not how much of Africa we knew. And so I believe that in helping Africa, the conversation then for all of you who are in education invested heavily there, it has to be able to help us tell our own story and educate our own people in our own systems and cultures. Second last is the place of leadership. Like I mentioned earlier concerning the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885, where 14 nations gathered with no African representative present, with a primary goal to regulate Europe colonization and trade in Africa, to present a full-scale war between European powers. A law was set in motion that when we define leadership up till now in Africa, it is viewed through the lens of acquisition, acquiring power, acquiring resources, acquiring longevity. But we thank God that now the mindset is changing slowly, especially in the young generation, for a future that demands a shift to this distribution. Like our Bible says, for those of you who read your Bibles, the greatest among us is supposed to be the servant of all. In a political realm, the most powerful leader is the one who makes himself unnecessary by empowering the generation of successors. The force of the future is a leadership mindset that prizes institutional integrity over individual charisma. We must build systems that are stronger than the men who run them. When our mindset shifts from what I can get, what I can live, and move to being a continent of strong men or a continent of strong states, at that point we shall have achieved the agenda. And lastly, in the issue of culture, we all know that culture is a software of a nation. And for so long, Africa has built around the definition of dances, beats, and folklore. That's how we define culture. But I believe that more than ever before, there's a proposition in the changing of mindset that culture is to become an engine of innovation. In Africa, we have a very famous term called Ubuntu. I am because we are. It is the ultimate framework for the modern co-build partnership. And while the world struggles with fragmented societies, Africa's cultural DNA offers a blueprint of integrated, high-level multilateralism. And so in this, we don't just need economists. We need thinkers who can call out this Ubuntu and build African communal wealth models that can become the antidote to the global loneliness of hypercapitalism. We are so one in Africa, even though we're divided by borders, and I believe that we can harness that unity. We must stop apologizing for our uniqueness, because sovereignty begins when we realize that our culture values are essential. If we do not value our narrative, we will continue to be characters in a story written by someone else. And to our international partners in this room, the era of help in Africa, like has been said by all who are speaking today, must come to an end because it assumes hierarchy. We want to start the conversation of alignment because that assumes equality, win-win situation. What are you bringing on the table, Africa? What is Europe bringing on the table of what is Europe bringing on the table? And how do we get this together to define the narrative? Because at the end of the day, the moral imperative remains the same. But we want to leave a continent where the next generation does not have to leave Africa to find their destiny. And so I charge us all not to just live with a list of to-dos, but a list of to-be. And I hope that the visionaries in this room understand that our greatest resource right now on earth is the wisdom, the mindset of the people. If we're investing, let's invest in the changing of the mindset of the people. I think Nelson Mandela once said that the bondage is not only in the man who is put in bonds, but the man that puts that man in bonds also. God bless you.